What a lucky 1%. No, well, that's, yeah. What do am I okay with it?
Yeah.
No. Can I change it? No. That would be a revolution.
Say that again.
70% of the British land is owned by 1% of the
70% of the British land is owned by 1% of the people.
Yeah. Are you okay with that?
No, not really. No, is that true?
That's a true statistic.
Jesus Christ, man, that's unbelievable. No, that's terrible. It's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's well, the land of the free doesn't exist, then, does it?
That's something. That's the crux of the growing gap, isn't it, between the people and the powers that be? And yeah, I think people owning all these houses. I mean, Jesus, the amount of slum landlords I've had in the past who live off having hundreds of houses. I wonder if Mr. Evangeli is listening. Yeah, that's. Yeah, I think that's one thing they could definitely put a limit on. The government could put a limit on how many properties a person can own. I think they're doing something about that with. So you have to live in your house in the country or rent it out. But I mean, Jesus, talk about too little, too late.
Well, it's pretty unfair and very, very unbalanced. I think it's something that's always, in this country we've always had to live with, and you kind of picking up old kind of novels, and you realise that actually things have changed. Then it was upstairs, downstairs, and people and you hear of a lot of kind of aristocratic families, upper class families that have lost and had to kind of sell their land or their homes and make them into kind of national trust, or the things are changing. But I do think the divide is awful between the rich and the poor, and I think it's a very difficult thing to break or change, because it's a system that's been going on forever and ever and ever. It should never have happened in the first place when it was divided. That's a problem. And how do you it's like anything, in countries like now Zimbabwe, people coming to reclaim their land and stuff, it's very, very difficult. Where do you start? But it would be good if it was definitely done on a fairer basis, and we could get some of the land back. Everyone has their own little bit. I think that's fair.
I think it's quite a shocking statistic, and I think it's amazing that it hasn't been publicised somewhere, that it doesn't, make a big deal of it. I think it kind of says quite a lot about the big gap that there is, the massive gap that's only getting bigger between the people that have and the people that haven't.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I just saw in the papers today, I mean, fair enough to struggling farmers for the last sort of 10 years or so, been hearing about how they've been really struggling and not been getting half the EU grants of all these Spaniards and Portuguese and whatever. And all of a sudden, have you just noticed the coincidence and the downturn of property has gone hand in hand with a huge upturn in the value of farmland, a shortage of food all of a sudden. And it reminds me of those, I think it was the Duke of Westminster, who, when they had a Labour government in the just after the war, brought in the idea of taxes on handing down property and land. What were they called, those taxes? They're still here, and I know they are today. The Duke of Westminster just leased his properties for 99 years in the very full knowledge, in the great span of history, as your aristocrat knows, of 14 generations of owning a bit of land, that it would come back to them at a period when it would be less onerous tax-wise. And the same process, all these people moaning about, and you suddenly find out there are still these aristocrats who own 35 trillion acres of land, will own the whole of Norfolk. And now, surprise, surprise, food prices are going up. And what was your original question?
Your answer's taking us in a better direction. The original question, how do you feel about that kind of disparity between sort of just 1% owning 70% of the land?
I think it's dreadful, yeah. I mean, it's something that the Italians and the French sorted out a long time ago. I spent quite a bit of time in Italy, and they split all the land up, and they have these things called contadinos. Every man got his, 4 square acres and a donkey. And it quite literally happened. I mean, it hasn't happened all over, but it's happened in huge swathes of Italy. It's only when it comes up like this that you realise that disparity. And then you always think, well, that's okay, they only own a bit of farmland, it's not really worth all that, a few fields and hedges. And then you realise, of course, the production of food is, what with water, is the ultimate. Even owning buildings pales into significance when you own the production of food. It's a very unfair process, yes.
I wasn't aware of the exact statistics, but I suppose it makes sense because of cities and towns. How I feel about it, I don't know. I suppose people don't live in fields.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I knew it was pretty. Yeah, I knew there was kind of like a lot of rich people owning a lot of land. That's an extremely high statistic. It's awful. It's awful. It's really bad. Like, people shouldn't, there's kind of links to that £2 million question. You know, where would you give your money to if you end up kind of like spending all your money on your own, like conquering the world? Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, I guess, you know, the old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think anyone should have too much power, and yeah, I think I don't think that that small amount of people should own that amount of land. But on the same hand, I wouldn't call myself a communist. I'm not like share it all out equally, because I think some people can work a bit harder or need more space, or you know, whatever, and there's circumstances where you can't kind of like be so like black and white about it. But yeah, that's a pretty sad state of affairs for Britain. I hope other countries aren't as bad as that.
Well, I think that land ownership is important. It's not as important as it was before, when we were an agricultural country, or even when we were a manufacturing country. Unfortunately, that 1 square mile of the land, which is the richest square mile on the earth, in the city of London, which abuts my constituency, is the worst form of land ownership.
Having 1% of the British population owning 70% of the land, you know, clearly appears not to make any sense at all. But I don't think we've found a way to really tackle that issue. I mean, you know, you can build theoretical constructs about kind of devolving that sort of ownership, but let's face it, we tried it in the 80s with this notion of a fantastic, you know, home-owning, share-owning democracy, and the fact was most people don't want to engage with ownership, collective ownership in those sort of ways. Exactly the same thing happened in Russia, you know, where things were, you know, they gave shares out in nationalised utilities to huge swathes of the population, and it ended up in the hands of 0.5% of these immensely rich oligarchs now. So I think, you know, it's a figure that on the surface looks terrifying, but you know, I'm more worried about the way that we get out of it rather than just kind of banging on about the statistic.